the God of the Bible wasn't originally the God of everyone.
All right, let's see it.
He was the God of Israel, a tribal national deity, just like every other nation had.
This is accurate. Adonai was the patron deity of the land and the people of Israel, and all the other lands and peoples around them had their own patron deities. And we see this reflected in a number of different ways across the Hebrew Bible. For instance, Adonai is repeatedly referred to as Eloheinu, our God. The land of Israel is Adonai's inheritance. Even in Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, at least according to the earliest recoverable form of this passage that we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, it says that the Most High apportioned the people according to the number of the Bnei Elohim, the children of God. And then verse 9 says, and Adonai's portion was his people, Jacob his share of the inheritance. So what this passage is describing is a distinct high deity divvying up the nations to their own children, Adonai being one of them, Adonai receiving as their inheritance the land of Israel. And the idea that other nations had their own patron deities who were not Adonai is also reflected in a number of different places and in a number of different ways. So we can go to Judges 11, for instance, where the messengers of Jephthah go to the Amorites, and they're arguing over whose land is whose, and the messengers say, you keep what your deity Chemosh has conquered for you, and we're going to keep what our deity Adonai has conquered for us. Basically putting them on the same playing field. And we see it as well in the fact that Naaman in Kings, when he comes to get healed in the Jordan River, wants to worship Adonai when he's back in Syria. But Adonai is the God of the land of Israel, so what does he do? He takes some of the land of Israel with him, 2 cartloads of Israelite soil, back to Syria, so that when he's in the temple, he can worship a deity who can only be worshipped on Israelite soil. And even though this is a foreigner, this agrees with, for instance, how David talks about it. When Saul is pursuing David, David complains to Saul, your men are forcing me to worship other gods, by pushing him outside of Adonai's inheritance. Why? Because you have to worship the deity who has purview over the land which you are on. So if David is outside the land of Israel, outside of Adonai's inheritance, it's another deity's inheritance that he is on. And similarly, once we get to the exile, we have the people along the river in Babylon lamenting, how can we sing the song of Adonai in a foreign land? And then you have a bunch of attempts to try to expand Adonai's purview during and after the exile so that the diaspora worshippers of Adonai can access their deity beyond Adonai's inheritance.
When you actually read the Old Testament without the church filter on.
So just one note here, referring to the Hebrew Bible as the Old Testament is an artifact of the church filter. So taking the church filter off is a lot more complex.
You start noticing a pattern. God isn't presented as a universal, all people, everywhere deity that we talk about today. He's presented as Israel's God, their protector, their warrior, their king. The text literally calls them his chosen people and says that their land was his portion. And over, you see the same story. Israel versus another nation, and Yahweh fights for Israel. He frees Israel from Egypt. He helps Israel conquer Canaan. He tells Israel to destroy certain tribes, and he gives Israel land that other people already lived on.
So we do have all these kinds of stories when it comes to pre-exilic Israel. And I think one of the most fascinating is where God sends an Israelite, Judahite, Edomite coalition to invade another nation that has thrown off vassalage, but then the other nation wins in battle. And it's interesting how the author tries to account for it. This is in 2 Kings 3. And Moab was a vassal to Israel, but then when King Mesha rises to the throne, he throws off vassalage. The exact same thing that Hezekiah is going to do when it comes to Assyria several chapters later in 2 Kings. But in this instance, they want to invade Moab, and they get a Yahwistic prophet who comes in and tells them exactly what they're supposed to do. So this Israelite, Judahite, Edomite coalition is having success until they get to the final city, and there, right as they're about to win, it says that the king offered his heir to the throne as a human sacrifice on the city wall. And then the very next words are, there was great fury against Israel, and they packed up and went home. This is the exact same thing that happens to the Assyrian king when he invades and is unable to take the final city where Hezekiah is holed up. And in that story, in 2 Kings 18 and 19, it's because an angel of the Lord has killed 185,000 Assyrian troops. And so the king is forced to pack up and go home. In 2 Kings 3, it is the offering of human sacrifice that catalyzes the intervention of the Moabite patron deity Chemosh, who drives the people out. Like the Assyrian king, the Israelite, Judahite, Edomite coalition, led by Adonai, promised victory by Adonai and by Adonai's prophet, fails. And they are forced to pack up and go home. So in that instance, the other patron deity of the other nation that was being invaded defeated the invading force led by Adonai. Adonai lost home court advantage and was defeated. And you can tell that the author is embarrassed about this because of how curt they are and how succinct the story is. It just says, well, there was great fury against Israel, so they packed up and went home, not wanting to acknowledge that what they're saying is that Adonai was defeated by the God of another nation. I think that's one of the most fascinating versions of this kind of story that we see told not only in the Hebrew Bible, but also in other ancient Southwest Asian inscriptions beyond the land of Israel. This is just how they rationalize these things anciently. And I think it's great that we have preserved in 2 Kings 3 a story where God loses.
If he was the God of the world, wouldn't those be his people too? Meanwhile, every other nation had their own gods, and they believed that their gods were fighting for them. This was normal in the ancient world. Every nation believed that their God was on their side.
This was perfectly normal. And just like how in the Hebrew Bible we find these explanations for how Israel was allowed to be defeated, it's usually because God was angry with them. There was fury from Adonai against Israel, and so God allowed another nation to invade, or God allowed another nation to defeat them in battle. We see the exact same thing in other texts from beyond the Bible and beyond the land of Israel. A good example is the Mesha inscription. Mesha was the king of 2 Kings 3, at least as near as we can tell. And we have an inscription from Mesha where he talks about how during the days of King Omri of Israel, Moab was allowed to be subjugated. In other words, they were allowed to be put under vassalage. Why? Because Chemosh was angry with his land. So this mid-9th century inscription shows the exact same rationalization for how your God can be in charge of your country and your country could still be defeated. It's because your God is angry with you. We see the exact same thing in the Hebrew Bible.
Israel was no different. The only difference is Israel's stories survived.
I'm going to offer another note here. I think it's important to note that it's not just that the stories survived, it's that the people survived. That's how the stories survived. That's why the stories still survive down to today.
Their writings became scripture, and later Christianity universalized their God.
So this is not accurate. The God of Israel was universalized prior to Christianity. And I think it starts when they're coming back from the exile. And we have a variety of different ways that God is made more mobile. God is allowed to move beyond the confines of their temple and the land of Israel. For instance, Ezekiel gives God a set of wheels. So the vision in Ezekiel 1 is God's throne that is no longer confined to the temple, but has all these fantastical wheels on this platform above which sits the throne. Ezekiel is pimping God's ride so that God can visit their people beyond the land of Israel. Another example of the universalization of Adonai is what we find in Psalm 82, which is using the divine council motif and the Reeve lawsuit motif and the God complaint lament to rhetorically universalize Adonai. And here's how that works. God stands in the midst of the gods to judge and condemns the gods for their neglect of their duties to uphold cosmic and social justice. How is this neglect manifested? the Babylonian exile. One nation was allowed to invade another nation and forcibly migrate that other nation. That is a violation of cosmic and social justice, and so for that, the gods have been negligent in their duty, so the God of Israel condemns them to mortality. You're no longer gods, you are now mortal. What this does is deposes them from their seats on the divine council. That means the patron deities of the nations are no longer there. The seats over the different nations of the earth now sit empty. And then in the last verse, the psalmist calls upon God to rise up and do what? Inherit all nations. So in Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, Israel is Adonai's share of the inheritance. After Psalm 82, we have deposed the patron deities over all the other nations of the earth, and their inheritances sit empty. Adonai will take over rule of all the nations of the earth. This, I argued in a 2018 Journal of Biblical Literature article, represents the more rhetorically effective universalization of Adonai. Now, the people of Israel are still the focus of most of the rhetoric. And so there is something that has to happen there. And I think once we get down to Christianity, we do see the expansion of the gospel to the Gentiles, which obliterates the ethnic boundaries around God's people. So there is a sense in which the way the people of God relate to God is different, but God's universalization over all nations is something that happens well before the New Testament and the life of Jesus.
But originally, Yahweh wasn't the God of the whole world. He was the God of Israel, exactly the way the text describes him. And once you see that, the violence, the favoritism, the chosen people language, all of it suddenly makes sense. And somehow we turn a tribal war god into the God of everyone everywhere without ever asking if that's what those stories were actually saying.
I don't think that alone suddenly makes sense of everything. It's a lot more complex than that. And this is actually the topic of my next trade book. We don't have a title that we've settled on quite yet, but basically I'm going to be talking about how the God of the Bible changes between the earliest literary layers and the latest literary layers. And not just how God changes, but why the authors and editors are changing God, how it is serving their own needs, their own interests, their own goals for the future. So keep an eye out for that book. I'm going to let y'all know when pre-orders are available, but it's probably going to be coming out around the middle of 2027. And the fit for this video has been Superman.